Again, thank you, Dr. Farkas, for hanging out with us and keeping with our technical difficulties. If you're at home, stay with us. Of course, if you're here, you're great. But with that, Dr. Farkas.
Thank you,
welcome.
Will. I should hasten to thank Pam and Barb for the invitation, Chris and Will for providing us with an opportunity and a place to have a discussion about these things. I'm hoping that I can get all of across the landscape of ideas that I'm anxious to share with you. We're good?
All right, go ahead, just roll and they'll get it.
All right, fair enough. Well, when I think about sharing ideas with you, I try to anticipate what it is I can do that you might find of interest. And you see on this first slide, maybe not, the challenge as I see it is to share some ideas with you that you may not have encountered, to provide a forward-facing vision for the prospects of Russia and Ukraine, and finally to capture the severe nature and consequences of the scale of the war and some of its implications. Well, I have a slide here that shows a map of Ukraine. The only thing that's significant about it is that it lists all of the countries that border the Ukraine. And we might just take a very brief moment to recognize that Moldova, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland, Belarus, and Russia all are neighbors of this large country. And of course, that doesn't account for the Black Sea, which is also on the border of the country. A basic primer would remind you that Ukraine is the size of Texas. It now has a population of about 44 million people, once 52 million people in the year 2000 when the last census was taken. It's clearly down from that. The median age is 40, and that's relatively young, of course. The number of ethnic Ukrainians in the country is about 78% of the population. The ethnic Russian population is estimated to be about 18% of the population. Now, these aren't very pure figures because, of course, many families have a mixed ethnic heritage, so you'd want to be careful about that. The gross domestic product before the war was $8,200 a year, which is middle range for developing a new country. And you want to remember that if we were dealing with the consequences of the war, for the world at large, we'd want to take account of the fact that Ukraine is one of the two major exporters of grains, of a whole variety of grains for the entire world. So before the war, Ukraine was largely responsible for feeding a very large percentage of the developing world, and of course, gaining some revenue from those exports in the process. Just remind yourselves that historically, Ukrainian territories that exist today have at various points in time in history been controlled by Austria-Hungary, Russia, Poland, Lithuania, the Mongols, the Cossacks, and the Turks. So this is a part of the world that has been trampled on a variety of periods in its history. I want to try to dwell, though, from the outset with the pre-war Ukraine since 2000, right? We could go very far back and it could get very complicated, but let's just talk about Ukraine since 2000, which I think provides you with the foundation for understanding what's happening today. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, which of course was in, yeah, super. After the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, 92, Ukraine struggled, to be perfectly candid. It struggled with its political leadership. Many of the spin-off places from the old Soviet Union simply elected the old communist leadership of various sorts. And Ukraine was experiencing some very uneven development. The transition from a centrally planned economy to an open market economy is very complex, very difficult, and Ukraine felt a great many of those traumas in the process of making that transition. Ukraine was redefining itself. How? As a non-nuclear weapons country. You remember, or you may not remember, that in the early 90s, Secretary Baker, the American Secretary of State, convinced the Ukrainians to broke up. 3 of the former 15 republics in the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. Ukraine was one of them. The United States was very eager to try to persuade the various parts, new countries, to give up their nuclear weapons, and they were successful in Ukraine. Most of you have heard from the news that the quid pro quo, the payment for agreeing to do that, was to provide some security guarantees for Ukraine, most of which Ukrainians would argue quite adeptly that we've not followed through on. To be honest and calculating and measured in the way we represent Ukraine, to be honest, Ukraine was overlooked in American foreign policy for about 15 years. We paid a lot of attention to the depleted Russia and its transitioning into a weaker, formidable, less formidable adversary. And in the process, Ukraine was, as I said, overlooked. Moldova, Georgia, and the Ukraine were constantly seeking security assurances from NATO, and in fact, not getting much attention. In 2008, you know that the Russian incursion into Georgia, technically speaking, Ossetia, garnered no Western response. That is to say, NATO and the United States and the various European countries paid attention, but did nothing. The problem as it advanced, I mean, the pattern was starting to develop that Ukraine was struggling politically, and in the process was trying to decide whether it was in a position to offload the old style communist leadership that in fact had real advantages in the elections, into the ballot box. You know that basically by 2014, 2 propositions were presented to Ukraine. One was the European Union's offer, which was to create a more elaborate commercial linkage and to create some trade inducements, some economic advantages. Were the Ukrainians to decide, were the Ukrainian government to decide to tilt to the West? That was counteroffered by the Russians, and it was a very appealing counteroffer. They offered commercial linkages. They offered secure energy supplies, which of course had been the linkage, the supplier for gas and oil in Ukraine traditionally. And they made it more interesting by offering a massive aid package. So, you know, if you didn't have other kind of considerations, if you didn't have baggage from the earlier experience, that was a pretty attractive offer. And the decision that was presented to Ukraine in 2014, in January of 2014, was one of these sorts of things. Do we tilt to the east, tilt to the west? And what tangibly can we expect from either of those? Let me remind you that I just said a few moments ago that the West had not paid much attention to Ukraine as a focal point. You know about Euromaidan. Maidan, of course, is the square on which the protests took place, and most people simply call it that entire political engagement Maidan. The issue, as I just mentioned, was to tilt west or east. Politically, though, it's really important that you understand that the Ukraine was already badly divided. Already. And I'll show you what I mean by that very quickly. This was not a uniform place where all of the people in this new country were on the same wavelength about what to anticipate from the future. That's a mistake there. The Yanukovych election actually seemed to endorse the tilt to the east. I'll show you how that looked in just a moment. Coalesced groups against the Russian dependency. In other words, the people who were against tilting to east were intrinsically against the notion that they would draw closer to Russia. And in the process of doing that, draw closer to the old style communist political dynamics. US politicians, though, during Maidan, went to Kiev and cheerleaded for the uprising. And in fact, it's quite fair to say that when they went there, they used their presence for their own political purposes and were cheerleading for the violence and the confrontation between the system. Remember, these are protesters in the street protesting the duly elected president in an election that European assessors said was pretty fair and free by comparison with that part of the world. So it was awkward. And as I say, Yanukovych, which is what it should have said there, a couple lines above, in essence was so threatened by the protests that he abdicated the presidency. So he simply left and out of fear of his own safety went to Moscow. Now, what's important about all of that, play games with the history and the mechanics, what was indicated was there was a void. The system was unprepared to talk about what it wanted. You understand that in protests and insurgencies of various sorts, it's easy to coalesce people in terms of what they're against. It's incredibly difficult to then say to them, okay, what do we collectively agree we stand for? And that became the problem. If you were to look at it carefully, you would recognize that after Yanukovych abdicated, there was a void, a political void for 3 to 6 months. That meant that the government was unformed, fluid, unfocused, and there was no leadership to which you could turn. If you were a domestic political player in Ukraine, or if you were in the international community at large. This was the opportunity that the Russians had been watching for. And this was the moment in time when they seized, through what they called the little green men, uniformed but undesignated characters, seized Crimea. They had their own historical justification for that, but in point of fact, it was the political void in the leadership of Ukraine that made that possible. Now, the real tragedy is that there was no response by the Ukrainian government and no response by the West. Zip. We lamented the fact that they had seized the Crimea. It's not the most critical of all features, except of course for Sevastopol, which is this huge military naval base. At the very same time that all of this is happening, and you need to embrace the idea that there was that much chaos, that much fuzziness, that lack of clarity about who's in charge. This was exactly the moment at which the Russian nationalists in the Ukraine claimed that the level of political chaos in Ukraine at this moment in time, in the winter, spring of 2014, was simply unacceptable. That it was too chaotic, it was too unstructured, it was too problematic. And they added to that the previous elections had validated their impression. These are the separatists in the East, in the Donbass and Luhansk. They argued that the new policies of a government that was likely to come to power was going to be insensitive to their interests. These are just a couple of pictures of that chaos in Maidan. You know that a number of people were killed in those protests. But this is what you really ought to pay attention to. There's a couple of maps here. And you remember I've suggested to you that the Ukraine, post-Soviet Ukraine, was already badly divided. And it becomes an explanation for why it is that it was so difficult to get politics to coalesce. Take a look. In the upper left-hand map that you see there, it's a map of people who identify themselves as Russian by percentage. And in the yellow, the percentage is about 10%. And in the blue, depending on how dark the color is, it goes all the way to 50 or 60%. Do you notice how it is that the entire country seems to be very clearly delineated between those people who identify very clearly as Russian? You can look at the map on the right. It's ethno-linguistic map of Ukraine. And the red are the places where people identify themselves as mostly Ukrainian speaking. And the brown areas are places where they're ethnic Russian majority. And the stripes that you see there are significant ethnic Russian populations. So the two maps there on the top really have a remarkable similarity. Then when you look at the two maps on the bottom, those are both political maps about how people voted. On the bottom left in 2004 and the bottom right in 2010. Notice the incredible match of those maps, right? The people who identify as Russian are selecting one candidate, and the others who identify as Ukrainians are selecting the other candidate. The numbers are not so very important, but you can take a close look at them if you care to. The same thing is true on the lower right. You notice it's really very, very much fixed. That these places look like two very clearly defined different places. Now, it's these people in the lower right hand of each of those maps that decided when the political void presented itself that policies were likely to emerge in which they were somehow disadvantaged. And if you want to know what the key issue was, it was about language instruction in the schools. The Ukrainian government had taken the decision that children in the East, where they were predominantly ethnically Russian, could not go to school in the Russian language. They had to go to school in the Ukrainian language. Now, you and I could easily be intellectual and say, well, the languages aren't all that much different and kids could have adjusted, but that of course would have removed the sensitivity and the emotion from the issue. So my point is this, the places were already experiencing radical differences of opinion about things. So what happens as a consequence? Luhansk and the Donbass coalesce around warlords. People in those eastern sections stepped up, probably with their own entrepreneurial interest at heart, and said, we can organize these communities to defend themselves against the Ukrainian government. And people, when they're subjected to a lack of protection from the normal institutions, like the normal police or other institutions that give you confidence about living in your community, it's quite natural. In fact, in lots of places in the world, we could show you that the pattern is exactly the same. As soon as you take away a community's sense of security, they will be much more inclined to affiliate with people who make promises to them, in this case, warlords. There were about 5 or 6 warlords that stepped up and organized smaller communities. 1 or 2 of them were assassinated by other warlords who were lusting after their own territories. But to this day, there are 4 or 5 such people who probably perceive themselves as patriots and nationalists of the Russian variety, who are still entrepreneurially becoming very wealthy. They control the flow of goods, contraband, legal and illegal kinds of things, and as a consequence have a very deep-seated interest in maintaining the status quo. The Ukrainian central government failed to act decisively. There was no apparent foreign support for Ukraine at that moment in time, and there was some Russian support for the separatists in the East at this very same moment in time. So we lost the initiative. We lost the capacity to make appeals to those people who had declared themselves separate. The West, I think, understandably, saw the conflict as a civil war or an insurgency. And for that reason, not a threat to the country's security. In other words, it was an internal problem that the Ukrainians had to sort out on their own. We didn't see it in the larger geopolitical context. By January 2022, the Russian leadership appears to be stable and moderate. I know that's not consistent with what you hear by the journalists, but that is the reality. They seem not to be taking advantage of the frozen conflict in Ukraine. So there doesn't seem to be any particular trauma. And there was, if you'll remember, when the Russians did decide to invade, there was no precipitating event. There was no crescendo moment or thing that took place that caused the Russians to be able to say, and that's why we're reacting. You know, Putin has got a very well-established reputation as a counterpuncher. That might not appeal to most of you, but that means he's intrinsically, at least up to this point, wasn't seen as an aggressor, because he was always finding a rationale for lashing back at somebody who had taken the initiative. All right, so what's Putin's vision? What are his claims? Well, to the Kremlin, the Ukrainian leadership appears in disarray. And that's not an altogether wrong assessment. And they appear, at least in terms of Western support, to be only marginally supported. More verbiage than substance. He argues that the new government, post-Maidan government, is illegitimate. Let's be clear, right after Maidan, there was no elected government. The duly elected president was driven out of office. He abdicated, but that raises issues, credible issues about legitimacy of the new government. The Russians argued that the new government was likely to abrogate the Sevastopol Treaty. The treaty had been negotiated between Russia and Ukraine based on the leverage that Russia had in oil and natural gas. And the argument was the treaty was established as a contract in which the Russians would have access to Sevastopol. That's that huge naval facility with 11 bays and over 800 naval ships. The only one of two natural harbors in the Black Sea. And for those of us that have been studying these things for a long time, the only warm water port of the old Soviet and now Russian Navy. And the argument by Putin was that the new government was likely to abrogate that treaty. In other words, simply ignore the fact that it had been negotiated by the president that had now abdicated and was no longer valid. And of course, there is always this sense in the Russians, sense about things that Ukraine is in the near abroad. The near abroad is the Russian term for the places that used to be in the Soviet Union that are our close neighbors, and the way in which they approach that region geopolitically is like Americans with the Monroe Doctrine. In essence, this is our backyard and you shouldn't mess in it. And anytime you hear the Russians use the term near abroad, they're trying to establish in your mind, or perhaps in their own mind, that there's a special relationship there and a special obligation for those places to behave the way the Russians expect them to behave. And finally, of course, they argue that the Ukrainian system has been subverted by neo-Nazis. That's patently absurd. I think there was something on the order of 0.5% of the people in pre-war Ukraine that identified with Nazi sympathies. Most of them, interestingly enough, are in Western Ukraine, which of course was not the place that the Russians felt the need to invade. So the regions of discontent you see there on the map, they're in gray, the eastern portion of Ukraine and the Crimea. So the political disarray is very real. And I think it's one of those component parts that the journalists don't account for because it's a complicated story. And nobody wants to hear that there was something that we could have done much earlier on to support the stability of Ukraine. The Rada, as you know, is the legislature. New legislatures in new countries tend to be pretty inept. Forgive me, but that's the case. They tend to be populated in many countries, including Ukraine, by young, bright, but inexperienced people who have responsibility for making very complex decisions. And in the case of a post-communist country, they've got the responsibility of creating an entire legal structure that didn't exist in the Soviet system. There's a longer story about that that would, I think, fascinate you if we got a chance to talk about it. But in point of fact, new post-communist systems have the challenge of creating most of the legal system from scratch. well, as I say, there's a longer and intriguing story about that. So the Rada, now, after the void that I've been telling you about, the man that gets elected is Poroshenko. He's a candy billionaire. People in that part of the world love candy. I think everywhere in the world love candy. He made an absolute fortune. He's an oligarch, and he was able to rally support. I've seen him on the TV recently, and he's sounding a whole lot more sane than he did when he was in the leadership, actually. He's become much more a patriot than he was before. But let's be clear, in the legislature, each and every day, you heard me, each and every day, there were protests. Protests about salaries, pensions, housing, utilities. If you paid attention each and every day to the legislature, it looked like the place was coming unglued in every which way. 3 out of every 4 Ukrainians polled said that they disapproved of the Poroshenko government. Bad news, huh? The number's about exactly the same with the Zelensky government. You need to understand that while Zelensky has become an impressive hero and a stalwart character by far, and a great wartime leader from everything we can tell, his image before that was marginal at best. There were people remembering he was a television actor, a comedian. They had trouble taking him seriously. In fact, a little factoid, while he was an actor and soon after when he was a campaigner, virtually all of his speeches are written by his wife. She may be the brains behind some of those remarkable, effective speeches that he gives. The reforms were ineffective. The budget was drained by the persistent fighting in the East. Now, it was very low scale, but the Ukrainians still had to invest substantial amounts of money to keep that frozen war frozen. So their budgets were being damaged to the point where they weren't able to perform as a government in any kind of oppressive way at all. There was political instability. And it was pretty apparent if you talk to people in Ukraine who are politically connected, that it was possible that the Zelensky government could become a casualty, that the measure of public support was thin. Now, that was certainly known to the Russian leadership and perhaps to Vladimir Putin. You do understand that there was no international help on the horizon. President Trump was singularly unsympathetic, and I'm being kind to him by saying that. He was remarkably arrogant and condescending in point of fact in the way he dealt with the Ukrainian leadership. Predictions were that the reforms were going to take more from 5 to 10 years, and most Ukrainians weren't patient enough to see that as a viable reform program. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, said that tangible results have yet to be achieved. And that's just the headline. You can imagine how the details get fleshed out. The point is that there were only a few trusted institutions in the era before the war. And they were the army, the church, and volunteers. Notice what's missing there. The legislature, the executive, the judicial system, and even the universities. Yeah, that's a pretty thin foundation from a political scientist perspective about what the prospects are. I thought I shared with you 2 interesting pictures of Zelensky, in my judgment. The conflict in the regions. Now, I'm trying to suggest to you that the East wasn't the only place where there was conflict. It was the only place where there was violent conflict. But the East had problems, of course, with uncertain allegiances and warlord control, entrepreneurship of the worst and most corrupt sort, and Russia's measure of engagement, which before this last major event in February, before the invasion, Russian engagement in the East was fuzzy, but real. That's my best assessment. It wasn't very tangible, but it was there. It was an undercurrent of support that made it possible for those warlords to continue to maintain their control. The central part of Ukraine, and Ukraine is very clearly divided into parts. In the central part, there was political weakness, public impatience, and uncertain foreign support. In the West, in Lviv and Western Ukraine, there were displaced populations already before the war. There were people who were sending their children and their families from the East, which was dangerous, to the West, which was still in Ukraine, but by far the most stable and pleasant part of the country to be in. There were overt discussions in Western Ukraine before the war about independence, about the chaos in the East was such that Ukraine really ought to break into parts, and that the Western Ukraine had a foundation for actually making itself into a healthy place. There was dissatisfaction with the very dialogue that the Zelensky government was having with the Russians. The sense in Western Ukraine is you shouldn't even be talking to these folks. Now, over time, that became prophetic, of course, but at the time, it wasn't so perfectly clear that that made sense. And finally, in Crimea, the ultimate embarrassment for Ukrainians was a sign of Ukrainian regime weakness and the inert international community that was willing to back that. The American community or the NATO community or the Western community collectively could have taken action. Just like today, it could take action in the Black Sea to prevent the blockade of Ukrainian exports. And in my view, just like today, I'm an advocate for the no-fly zone. This is Ukrainian airspace over Ukrainian territory, and it seems to me with absolutely no justification that the Russians could somehow perceive that as aggressive or an escalation. I need to digress for just a second. I tend to be pretty adamant about that. Air Force pilots, whether they're Polish, Ukrainian, American, mercenaries, whatever, they're trained technicians and flyers. They're militarily capable warriors. Yeah, that's what they train for. That's what their jobs are. My sense, sending some of them into the skies, even against the Russians, would not turn out to be much of a disaster. But at least they're up for the job. That's their job. What would be the dividend if we did that? We'd probably be saving on the order of 10, 15, maybe 20,000 civilians' lives who are not trained to defend themselves, who are not able to defend themselves. Now, if you ask me, that's an equation worth embracing. Yeah? And I would make that case adamantly as I could. The Donetsk regional conflict. Well, the major fallout for the Ukrainians is protracted war in the East. What does that do? Remember, the conflict's been frozen from roughly 2015 till the war started in earnest. Yeah, frozen conflict. We'll deal with that in a second. What did that do? It scared away investors. It destroyed the Ukrainian budget. For the Ukrainian leadership, ending the war was politically unacceptable. It was political suicide. Poroshenko couldn't do it. Zelensky couldn't do it. Continuing the war was a guarantee to continuing political instability in the Ukrainian political environment. The new army was costing the Ukraine about 5% of gross domestic product, and Ukrainian victory was unlikely in the frozen East. Yeah. Heating up the conflict would bring more Russian military aid to the East and didn't seem like a very intelligent gambit. Political and military solutions were unworkable, is the point. I'm quoting here from an important source that said, none of the actors involved appeared to be ready to adjust their positions to find a solution. 8 years, 7+ years of nonsense debate. The frozen conflict. You should be aware that that's a common pattern in post-Soviet space. The new Russian dynamic in international affairs is to engineer frozen conflicts, military incursions followed by a de facto occupation of a small region, small up to this Ukrainian event. Abkhazia is a case, Nagorno-Karabakh is a case, Southern Ossetia in Georgia is a case, Transnistria is another case, and the Crimea. And now, of course, the Donbass, all of which fits into a very clear Russian pattern. I won't dwell on the fact that the Minsk II agreement was the one last best diplomatic initiative for resolving the frozen conflict in the East, and it went astray. Both the Ukrainians found it unacceptable, and the Russians tended not to commit themselves. Moscow recognized, now the way Moscow engineers these things, Moscow recognized documents issued by separatist authorities in the so-called Donbass or the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So they told the warlords to declare their regions People's Republics, and then the authorities can make the ruble in those areas the official currency. This has left people with little or no opportunity but to, in some measure, conform. Russian-backed separatists have begun seizing the property of Ukrainians, mostly rich Ukrainians, because that's more attractive for seizing, but for general Ukrainians as well. The speculation that's commonplace is that Russia intends an outright annexation of those territories, that it will, on that rationale, make the case that that is now part of Russia, just the way they did in Crimea. For those of you paying attention on a day-to-day basis, you know that's what's happening in Kherson. Kherson is that city on the very base, the very southern edge of the Dnieper River. It's the last port. If you've ever been in Kherson, it's not much of a place, to tell you the truth, but it's down there at the bottom, and it anchors the river system, virtually the Mississippi River of Ukraine, and it has already declared itself a Russian enclave. It's appealed to Putin to make it officially a part of the Russian system. That would be very odd, wouldn't it? I mean, geographically, like a satellite. And some of the Ukrainian reaction is funny. They say, well, they might as well be proposing to be part of Mars or Jupiter, as much as the Russian Republic. So the backdrop, well, from an official Russian perspective, the origin of the conflict dates back to the 2014 coup of Yanukovych. The issue from a Russian view is that language autonomy in Donbass and Luhansk is an important issue that the Ukrainian government was unable to work through. My suggestion is obvious to you, right? This was something that could have been managed far more effectively had the political system in Kiev had their act together. This was not an irresolvable conflict by any stretch of the imagination. The Maidan uprising caused the appearance that the system was moving toward the West. The results: cautious Russian support for warlords in the East and the frozen conflict. The frozen conflict was frozen because of the extraordinary, and I emphasize the extraordinary profiteering. Those people in the East whose names you don't know, who have organized their own communities for their own personal advantage, are getting wealthy. They're controlling weapon systems, they're controlling food, they're controlling housing, they're controlling people's ability to move about, mobility, they're controlling currency. They are simply dictators in their own little communities. Negotiations with them, of course, naturally, are unpopular and unproductive, right? I mean, who wants to have a meaningful, plausible dialogue with someone that's already so very exploitive? Now, there are lots of reasons that myself and others did not expect the invasion. Let me just tick them off, right? I was really quite sure that the circumstances were such that anybody in the Kremlin would see how unworkable the invasion was well before it took place. One, the United States, the UK, and Canadian military were training the Ukrainian military for 8 years right outside of Lviv, huge military base. When I was moving around in Lviv, I'd meet a lot of young Americans that were dressed kind of normally, but they clearly weren't tourists. And they weren't in military uniform, but when you started chatting with them, they became a little less lucid about who they were and what they were doing. We had an overwhelming presence there, and the training was, as it turns out now, we know, quite effective. The Ukrainians were enlisting an auxiliary force for years, both a serious force and a youth scout-like recruitment process. The Ukrainians showed an intense interest in non-Russian weapon systems. They were smart enough to know that they were ultimately going to have to, if they were challenged, going to have to use non-Russian weapon systems to have the decisive advantage. The Russians, on the other hand, seemed to ignore the decided advantage they had in cyber warfare. It's confusing to me to this moment why it is that the Russians didn't turn to cyber arenas to make things dysfunctional. You understand that people in a society very much look to their government for stability and performance. One of the things that cyber warfare can do, invisibly, is to make things not work. The banking system, the utilities, the infrastructure, the airline. And the Russians didn't seize on their opportunity to send that message that would have translated by normal Ukrainians to, damn it, our government isn't capable of serving us, performing for us. They just didn't seize the opportunity. The Russians failed to recognize the diminished capacity of its bloated general staff. There were actually more generals in the Russian army than there were non-commissioned officers. It was that bloated. And that means, of course, that an awful lot of those people were not competent military strategists. And yet they've been thrown into the conflict, many casualties at the general staff level, and all kinds of fumbling. The other thing that the Russians miscalculated and continue to miscalculate. So for those of you worried about the future, they failed to understand that urban and insurgent techniques of warfare are going to become increasingly popular, especially when you're up against a formidable force like the Russian military. And that increasingly is what the Ukrainians are doing so successfully. They're behaving like insurgents, hit and run kinds of things, no confrontational, no, square up, you shoot at me, I shoot at you kinds of warfare, which is the only kind of warfare that the Russians are trained to manage. And finally, the Russians have failed to recognize the muscle of miniaturized weapons that can be carried around in a suitcase or a briefcase, including our drones, which have been remarkably successful. The context? Well, the context is simple. Trump was unconcerned, unaware, and unsupportive of NATO. Not just Ukraine. He wasn't sure that NATO was at all useful, and as a consequence, undermined, at least in the Russians' view, their anticipation of a NATO response. They failed to acknowledge the absence of what I like to call internet discipline among young soldiers. You may not think that's very important. I happen to think it was very important. They ran into a problem in Syria when the generals said, we're not there. And the young people that you and I know were all on their cell phones saying, here, mom, look, this is where I am. Don't believe them. I'm not in Crimea training. I'm, in Kherson or I'm someplace else. And no matter what the Russian military has attempted to do to punish the soldiers, like our young people here, they show absolutely no willingness to embrace that discipline. We have a problem in our military like that, but not nearly as severe as the problem in the Russians. And of course, the problem is compounded when the general staff is saying, we're not doing that, when in fact, every bit of evidence that, every one of our cell phones geolocates us, right? I mean, it's not like there's any debate. You take a picture and 2 years from now, it'll tell you exactly where you were when you took that picture. So the technology has failed them. And finally, I think you see it there in gold. The Russians have failed to recognize the extraordinary changes that have taken place in the world, just from their 2008 incursion in Georgia. The live coverage of events, the satellites, the cell phones, the in-country reporters. When have we ever had the kind of news that you get from 5 different Ukrainian cities from 6 different networks on a day-to-day basis? So the in-country reporters, the news agencies, the global live broadcasts. You can't say it didn't happen. It's live. The camera people are there. Yeah. The satellites are showing you where the tank is. There's no place to hide in today's world, and the Russians just don't account for that. The net effect of that is that what they have always enjoyed superiority at is controlling the narrative. And this is the first war in which they have no capacity, zero capacity to control the narrative. No matter how disengaged you and I are, or how little we listen, the claims are bogus. You just can't give them credibility. And as a consequence, the entire dynamic of Russian foreign policy is sinking down in the muck. They won't be able to recover that over time. So crossing sovereign boundaries, February 24th, Russia invades. The military occupation is taking place in the east. There's no credible claim that the Ukrainians were mistreating or killing civilians in their own people in Donetsk or Luhansk. Full-scale penetration of the Ukraine from 3 sides ended up a dismal failure. Spasms of military confrontation and violence in most of central and eastern Ukraine were the very common characteristics of the war. It's untenable and untrue that the Russian claim that the UK is controlled by Nazis and that the current government is criminal and illegitimate. It's now been duly elected. And yes, it has all kinds of difficulty with its own popularity. It is certainly politically legitimate. I won't belabor the point of this slide. You might just look at the graph. If you're worried about Russian military expenditures, you'll notice that if you look very carefully, the chart begins at 2010, ends in 2020. That's the erratic nature of Russian military spending. And it is anything but consistent. The Russians have had all kinds of problems. Generally speaking, every year, the Russian budget that's presented to the government is fulfilled at the level of about 1/3 of what they request, what the official budget has in it, because the system has difficulty generating revenue. It's still the case that only about 17% of all the people in Russia and all the companies in Russia actually pay their taxes. For those of you that have been with me before, you know that what that means is that everybody in Russia is a tax evader and is vulnerable to a claim of indictment for that. Military unknowns. We're getting toward the end here real quickly. Unknowns, things we don't know. Can the Russian military tame the warlords in Eastern Europe? Are they going to give up their hold just because the Russians say, we're here now, we'll take over? I think they could actually end up insurgencies against the Russian occupation if the Russians try to control Donetsk and Luhansk. We're not hearing about that at the moment. Can they manage the narrative? Can they somehow recapture the propaganda positions that they have so badly bungled? Is the reticence of the United States and others to engage our own troops in the war a temporary proposition or a permanent one? Is there absolutely nothing that the Russians can do that's so heinous that would get us to make a commitment of a more formidable kind? I've always believed that there are things that could trigger a different kind of posture. I'm not sure. I don't study the Biden and the other positions as clearly as one might. Is the reticence of the US, well, I've already said that. Does the Russian military know what the end game is? I can swear to you, they have no idea. Absolutely none. Quite like our situation in Afghanistan. You know, any intelligent person could tell we didn't have a clear signal that we could send to the people making the fight. And that is clearly the case for the Russian engagement. The net effect, of course, is where the war is energizing NATO. Let me just point out to you, the invasion of Ukraine turned back the clock on confrontation psychology by about 75 years. That is to say, if you want to figure out where NATO's head is at the moment, just dial back about 75 years into the thick of the Cold War, and there you got it, right? You know that Finland and Sweden are ultimately now going to give up their neutrality and join NATO. And in fact, the Russians have managed to do exactly what they had hoped not to do. So the ultimate test of Putin rationality. In the first 20 years of his presidency, responsible critics of Putin would tell you that he was rational, measured, and calculating. You may not like that, and journalists oversimplify, but that's the reality. The reality is that he acted rationally, not very aggressively, measured his language, and calculated carefully Russian foreign policy moves. He broached formidable challenges for all those who underestimated him. And that was a lot of folks in the West. And finally, his policies were not at every turn anti-American, not by any stretch of the imagination. So all of a sudden, a major transition and a war in Ukraine that is very, very hard to explain. So what we know about the war: the Russian army is ineffective. Smart weapons are in short supply in Russia, and they're using more crude, less targetable weapons than they would like to. They're not controlling the narrative. Ukrainian ire is intense and is the foundation, the very core of their fighting spirit. The world is waking to the new threat to sovereign boundaries. This could set a precedent that says sovereign boundaries don't count for much. NATO finds a new purpose. The Russians are hoping for tacit support from Ukrainians living in the East. And I'm predicting for you that's not going to happen. And finally, Russians are turning to the Eastern and Southern design, hoping that they can create a landlocked Ukraine. So what's changing? Well, the spotlight. What's going to happen is the world is going to look upon things Russian and with deep suspicion, caution, and anger. They'll not be trusted to participate in global solutions. In terms of the rhetoric, it will never be viewed as credible again as long as Putin leads. International organizations of all varieties are going to reassess the inclusion of the Russian Federation. They're going to be outcasts. Russian progress to integrate into the commercial world will be set back, and their ability to compete will be permanently damaged by sanctions. What's not changing? Russia will maintain a nuclear arsenal under increasing stress. Russia will remain rich in many raw materials, but will increasingly have pressure by the fact that there'll be fewer consumers. Russian leadership will remain unrepentant, rationalizing beyond all logic and credibility. And finally, we'll need to redirect ourselves to watch Russians far more carefully. The prospect, real quickly, short term, Russia can prevail. It can hold Luhansk and Donbass. Russia cannot keep pace with the Russian arms supplies or with the Western arms supplies. We will outsupply the Ukrainians, and as a consequence, they will outmaneuver and fight the Russians in most places. Russians are threatening nuclear conflict, but when they do that, they eliminate all bargaining position. There's no foundation for bargaining with them in that situation. Long term, this is really important. Ukraine can survive, but doesn't win. Okay? You can't lose all that they're losing in people and substance. Real things, tangible things, housing, manufacturing, agriculture. You can't call it a win. You can survive, you can defeat the enemy, but you can't win and lose that many people. The loss of valued population, housing, manufacturing, agriculture. My sense is that there will be no definitive closure to the conflict. And that will have implications for returnees. All the people you know who have fled, the question for them will be, is it viable to return? Is there something to which we want to return? Now, the emotional answer is, of course, yes, our home. But when it comes down to the practical dimensions of it, it's going to be very, very difficult for returnees. Some will, I know. And finally, Ukraine is capable of long-term insurgency, even if the Russians were to control the East for a while. The Ukrainian capacity to engage in insurgency with those mini weapons will eventually drive the Russians out. So what happens? Putin remains in power until the 2024 election. He will. With or without Putin, Putinism will continue. No person will replace Putin who doesn't have to subscribe to Putinism. And it'll be interesting for us, right? Whoever comes as president on the Republican side may have to be committed to Trumpism. We'll see what happens there. Donor countries will suffer donor fatigue. That's my greatest worry for the future of Ukraine, especially in contested democratic systems like ours. People will begin to debate. We spent billions of dollars to help them win the war, or at least survive the war, but are we willing to continue to spend billions of dollars for the reconstruction and rehabilitation of Ukraine? And I'd worry about that. With our polarization in our political system, it's very unlikely that that will hold. Russia cannot pay reparations. I know enough about the economy there, they can't afford that. They couldn't do it if they wanted to do it. And of course, they don't want to do it. Assets from the sanctions will evaporate. All of those yachts and palaces and places, companies that are being seized, somehow, I can't tell you how, but somehow that'll all evaporate. And finally, in domestic Ukrainian politics, after the conflict, after the war, there will be a lot of debate there about getting on the same wavelength with one another, about how or when to reconstruct. And I would worry, having my first State Department project in Ukraine was anti-corruption. I would fear the return of those kinds of behaviors that we worked so hard to get rid of. In a post-war environment, there's going to be lots of money floating around and an awful lot of hands grabbing a hold of it. All right, well, I'm really done. I wanted to say just one thing about the scale of the war, and let me just jump to the last notion. I think what we're talking about is the scale of a war that inflicted such a wound on Ukraine that if you can use a medical analogy, it may be a wound that's too dramatic to heal. I think, we're being Pollyanna to think that a society can take that much pain and destruction and simply rally. It's certainly the case that they've rallied to fight, but can they rally to get on the same wavelength about what kind of vision for the future they want to create? And remember, before the war, there was never that kind of consensus. There was never that kind of track record. There was never that kind of focus. That's what I've got for you. I'm sorry it ran a little long, but seemed to me to be important things for you to think about.
And plus, a few technical difficulties delayed your start, so it's not that long. Thank you, Dr. Farkas.
Sure.
Do you have a few minutes for a few questions?
By all means, and thank you for being patient with me.
Okay. Well, we do have Greg on, who's watching us online, and he asks, prior to the February invasion, the Ukrainian government had a reputation for corruption. With the significant infusions of Western dollars and to combat Russia, are there any attached conditions to ensure its use as intended? And is there any possibility of current operations within Ukraine by US, NATO to convert forces?
Okay, let's start at the top. When the IMF and the World Bank give money to Ukraine, there are conditions. The problem is that those conditions become very soft and fuzzy. And so the reality is when the IMF gave Ukraine, and for that matter, Russia, both money to prop up their economies, lots of that money disappeared. So it's easy to make conditions, but it's incredibly hard to enforce those conditions. As I told you, my first project was about corruption. And as you can well imagine, there's no subject that's more complicated than that. My own approach, which is halfway institutionalized, at least in Western Ukraine, is that corruption is there's really two kinds of corruption. There's corruption by design. That's the kind of corruption where wealthy people maneuver for their own benefit and steal money from others or banks or the system. Those are the ones where people become oligarchs and super wealthy. But there's a second kind of corruption, which is characteristic in Ukraine and other post-communist systems. It's far more sinister. That's the kind of corruption that exists among everyday people. It's the kind of corruption that stems from the lack of confidence in the system and the institutions. It's the kind of corruption where you're willing, you know that the shoes are supposed to cost X, but you know that the only way you can get those shoes is to pay 2 times X. The everyday kind of activity that ignores the fundamental design and rules of the system. Even when you get on a bus in Lviv, you know, there's an official bus fare and then there's a cigar box in the front of the bus and you have to put extra money in that box. And if you don't, you know, the door doesn't open all the time or you don't find a place. So there's an undercurrent. And the project that I was involved with the State Department was an attempt simply to make it clear to people that these are not victimless crimes. Every time you violate the rules for your own advantage, every time you pay off somebody to give your daughter a job, you know, there's a way in which the system is diminished. And so the whole prospect of challenge of corruption is a very pervasive, fascinating, but super complex task. Yeah.
Thank you. Mary Ann has a question here.
Sure.
I have heard some reports that Putin is not healthy.
Yeah.
What have you heard?
Yeah.
And what would happen if he could no longer serve?
Generally speaking, he's a remarkably agile person for his age. He's 70 years old, but he works out every morning with Medvedev before breakfast. They're pretty healthy, but he's got bowel cancer. And he will be operated on if he hasn't already been operated on. So what do I know about bowel cancer? Very little. I just know it can't be good. You know? And as a consequence, what I can tell you is that the track record of the Russian health system is very modest. Most medical doctors have 5 years of medical school. We call it undergraduate, 5 years of undergraduate medical training. When Boris Yeltsin had a heart condition, they brought Dr. Bakey from Houston with a heart-lung machine to Moscow to do the procedure. They obviously didn't have enough confidence in their own medical staff. My guess is that they'll probably bring somebody from outside the country to deal with Putin. Maybe because of a lack of expertise, maybe because of some political sensitivity or concern that somebody might not be a big fan of his. My guess is that we'll find out ultimately that a Finnish doctor was brought. But I don't have a sense about his condition. if anybody can survive it, he's starting from a very solid platform. He's an energetic, spry 70-year-old.
We have one last question on Zoom, so I'm over here. And William would like to know, do you have any comment on the John Mearsheimer assertion
Yeah.
that threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine could lead to a Russian reaction?
Yeah. Many of you who have lived in the Chicago area for a very long time know that one of the most prominent political science professors in the region is John Mearsheimer, who's been a political science professor at the University of Chicago for a long time. I have been for the last 20 or 25 years on television with him. We've often had fascinating discussions, and we don't always disagree, in point of fact. He's now retired, and I don't mean to talk out of school, but I think he's become a bit detached. He's now making the argument that the invasion of Ukraine is justified from a Russian perspective because of our foreign policy. Now, I think I've already hinted at the fact that we are not without having contributed to the environment that created an uncertainty on the part of the Ukrainians and certainly support for them. But it's patently absurd to make the case that, as Mearsheimer is recently, he's become a real tool of the Russian foreign policy media machinery. They quote him every other day, out of context in some cases, but he's such a prestigious character that just associating his name with some Russian justification has mileage. I have heard from no less than 20 Russian emigres to the United States who say, what about Mearsheimer's, justification for the war? I suggest to you that carefully and unemotionally, what Mearsheimer's saying doesn't make a lot of sense. He's a knowledgeable guy, due respect for sure, but in this particular case, he's way off base. Did I write him the very first time I saw the Russian Foreign Ministry quote him? Yes, I wrote him, first name basis. I said, do you realize that this is happening, that you've become, the poster boy for American criticism? And he didn't respond. So I can't tell you much about that, but it's a damn good question.
Thank you so much for coming tonight and traveling with us and being here with us. I know we all want to give him a round of applause and our ultimate thanks. As we leave tonight, wiser and more informed than when we walked in our doors or turned on our screens.
Well, if there's anything we can walk away with, it's a sense that it is a pretty complicated reality that we're trying to understand, it really is. And the extent to which you want to be emotional in your support. Right after the war started, I did a broadcast to my friends in Ukraine. And you probably know that DePaul University offered all of the university students in Ukraine the opportunity to take free courses online for as long as the conflict lasts. So I'm very proud of that. And I think as a country, we're doing what we need to do. But as I told you before, I'm worried about our sustaining that commitment. So thank you for listening, really.
Thank you.
Applaud you.
And we hope you all will join us again on June 9th, where we'll have Supreme Court update by our well-known speaker, Dr. Steve Schwinn. So until June, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us at this month's Civic Awareness Series, and we hope to see you either virtually or live next month. Thank you again for dealing with all of our technical issues. We greatly appreciate it. Have a great evening.